Last time we began on page 150 with Chapter 2, Level 3 case problem, determining inventory levels for CKG Auto. We worked through number 7 on page 151, and now we will pick up on page 152 with number 8. It says, recommend a target inventory level needed for a 5-day period based on the following. To be on the cautious side, assume each day's supply will be equal to the average daily demand for all locations combined plus 3 standard deviations. Because the mean and standard deviations might not already be integers, round the daily demand up to the nearest whole number and then use this calculated daily demand, average plus 3 standard deviations, to calculate demand over a 5-day period. Place this recommendation just below the top and bottom analysis, again clearly identifying it. Add the label bearing recommended to identify the cell containing the actual value. Remember last time we said generate some simulation using the random function, then take these things and copy and paste them as values so that they don't change. Because if you have a random function here that's generating that, then every time you put a new formula, it's going to change those numbers. So if I put a formula here equals sum of 1 and 2, when I press enter, all these random numbers changed. So we copied and pasted them in here as values so they won't change. Obviously your values will be different from mine because they're random. But the main thing is we wanted to find the daily needs of all 10 of these customers on a simulation, and then we said what's the rank, and then we said give me the 5 highest. We said let's rank these things, and then they said here's the rank. And one way you can check the rank, we looked at this last time, is I can sort this by the rank, and I should have them in order from top to bottom. I'm going to insert an extra column here so that it is not part of this table, and let's clear the formatting out of there. This is a nice little feature right here. To clear the contents, that's the same as pressing the delete key, but it leaves the formats, it leaves the comments. Sometimes you want to clear comments. Sometimes you got a bunch of hyperlinks and you're tired of clicking in the cell and it launches the hyperlink. But this is the only place I know of to clear everything out of a cell. There may be another way, but this clears everything: the formats, the contents, the comments, the hyperlinks, everything. So if I sort this by this column by rank, I'm going to go in here and say data. I'm going to sort this from Z to A, well, smallest to largest, A to Z. Oh, it sorted the things above it. I didn't want that because it's got this stuff. You want a blank column and a blank row all around your data so that it recognizes this. Notice if I click in the middle of the data and I say Control A to select all, it only selects what it sees as that contiguous data, which is what I wanted at that point. Now if I do Control A again, it'll expand out and do the whole worksheet, every cell on the worksheet. So Excel is really good at recognizing related data as long as you have a blank column and a blank row above and below and to the left and the right. You don't want to have a completely blank column or a completely blank row in the middle of your data, or it won't think the rest of it is part of it. So if I sort this from A to Z, it says here's number 1, and these are the lowest to the highest. So this was the daily need that was the lowest on day 20 in our simulation, and then the highest thing was right there, and that was on day whatever it is, day 98. on those 10 customers. So what we're trying to do is say, how can we anticipate, keep enough in stock so that we can satisfy our customers' orders but not have to fill the warehouse. These are huge bearings, so we don't want any more than what we think we need. So here's the highest, the 5 highest levels that anybody needs. Here's the 5 lowest levels, and we saw here are the lowest 5, and then at the bottom end here are the highest 5, 90, 90, 85, and a couple of 84s. Now down at the bottom of this, let me sort it back by, I guess day number is what we had it sorted by. Now if we go down to the bottom of this column, they asked us to put the mean, the median, the mode, and the standard deviation of these totals per day. So we said take the average of that column, take the median, the middle one, and your numbers will be different. Take the mode dot single and take the standard deviation dot s. And what they're telling us in number 8 is first we want to round the daily demand up to the nearest whole number. This may not be a whole number, so let's round it. I'm going to round the average of that. Let's see if it is a whole number. If we copy this and paste it as a value, right here I'm just going to paste it as a value, which is that 123. Notice it's actually 64.87. We're just formatting it to look like 65. It's really 64.87, but they want us to round that up because we're not going to store 0.87 of a bearing. We want the next higher one. So we would want to use the round function on here. So I'm going to round that thing. So that's the number I want to round. And how many digits do I want to round it to? Well, if I said 2, it would be 2 decimal places. If I said 1, it would be 1 decimal place. If I say 0, that's the nearest whole number. If I said -1, that's the nearest 10. It goes the other direction. So I'm going to say 0, and that should round it to the nearest whole number. Yeah, I've got to put an apostrophe, a parenthesis after it. And now notice if I copy and paste this as a value, copy, paste it as a value, it says, oh, that actually is 65 now because we rounded it to the nearest whole number. Questions on that? So we want to round each of these things to the nearest whole number. And after we've done that, then we want to come up here and say, let's find our average daily bearing. How much should we have in stock for a 5-day period? So we're going to say recommended 5-day bearing inventory level, and they want us to make it look pretty, make it look different. Let's combine these, merge and center them across those 3, merge and center these across those 3. There we go. So the formula that they want is, we want 3 of these standard deviations. So I'm going to say 3 times, and our standard deviation is down here. So I'm going to click that and do an absolute value because we always want it to go there. We want to take 3 standard deviations, add it to the daily mean, which is down here, and I'm going to make that an absolute reference. That's for 1 day. Here's the average, but they say, well, it could be as high as 3 standard deviations away. So that's for 1 day, so we're going to put parentheses around all that and then multiply it by 5. We could do it at the beginning or at the end. I'll do it at the end, times 5. And that would be our recommended daily bearing, not daily, but for 5 days to have in inventory. Notice that when we use cell references like this formula does not really explain what these are. We have to go look in those cells to see what those are. But if we had named those cells an appropriate name, then that would show up in our formula. Let's illustrate. If I go down to our mean, median, mode, standard deviation, I'm going to click on this cell that contains the mean. I'm going to go up here, and it's cell L105, but I'm going to click in the name box and call it mean. Actually, I'll call it, let's call it mean. I don't know if they'll let me name it that. Yeah, sometimes if it's a reserved word, you couldn't name something SUM. And then standard deviation, I'm going to name that L108 cell STD DEV. And when you name a cell or a range of cells, it is an absolute reference. So what I'm going to do is now I'm going to go back up to my formula, and instead of having those cell references, I'm going to start typing mean right there, and notice it says, oh, I see there's some range named MEAN, and that's what I want. So I'm going to double click on that, and then this one is my standard deviation. And it says, oh, I see there's a range called STD DEV. And now the formula does the same thing, but this is much more self-explanatory, isn't it? After I use the names of the cells, that formula is much more self-documenting. Notice when I press enter, I get a much different answer than I had before. That's because I used the names, but I put them in the wrong spot. I actually want 3 of the standard deviations plus 1 of the mean. So I think I'll turn that around and say I only want 1 mean plus 3 of the standard deviations. Now I should get 490. And let's do a nice formatting of this. I'm going to use this same formatting. Get the format painter and paint all these, not all these cells. Oh, that wasn't merged and centered. So I may have to do that again. So let's merge and center. You can only do them 1 row at a time. If I try to merge and center both of these, it's only going to give me what's in the upper left cell, and it would wipe out that inventory level. So we'll do this merged and centered, this merged and centered, and this centered. And isn't that lovely? Number 9 says, the warehouse manager has tracked 5 different parts over the past 5 days. He's recorded this in another workbook named demand.xlsx, and we are supposed to copy that data and put it on a new worksheet named actual demand. So I'm going to put a new worksheet here called actual demand, 2 words. And I'm going to go look for that spreadsheet called demand.xlsx, copy all the data from it, and paste it in this worksheet. Notice in addition to the student data files, I've also supplied you with the chapter files. These are the figures and illustrations that are used in the chapter. For instance, on page 141, there is a figure 2.42. Chapter 2, Level 3 figures, they misidentified it, but it actually is Chapter 2, Level 3. And there's 242A, which appears at the top of the page. Here's 242B, which appears right under it. And that allows you to play along with the book and not have to retype anything. Number 10 says to make a little table like this and figure out certain things. The table is listed on page 152, and basically they want us to say how many items were shipped that are bearings, timing belts, what was the total value of items shipped, and what was the average days held in inventory. All that information is to the left here, and this is a great example of the sum if and average if functions. I'm going to spread this out so that I just have one line and auto size those row heights Here's the idea. We've got things listed as they sold them. So I sold this timing belt for $34.95. It had sat there for 31 days. I sold this fan belt for $3.59. The next thing I sold was this. The beauty of using a computer is you can list those things as they happen, and then you can sort them or use the data any way you want to. So if we say, I want to know how many bearings were shipped. Every time I would see a bearing, I'd want to count that cell, wouldn't I? So we can say count what's in this column if it says bearings. So right here I'm going to say count everything in this column if it says bearings. So let's use our COUNTIF function. Let's use the insert function so that it'll explain it a little better. We want the COUNTIF. There's our COUNTIF function. It says it counts the number of cells within a range that meet the given condition. So I'll say, okay, first thing it needs is a range. Range is the range of cells from which you want to count non-blank cells. And I'll say, well, that's this range over here. So I'm going to select A2 and go all the way down, Control Shift arrow down to A992, and I'm going to hit my F4 key, function 4 key, to say that's always the range I'm going to want to count. When I copy this formula down, I don't want that range to move down. So that's the range I want to count, and then this says what is the criterion that we want to use to determine whether or not we count that cell. And because we're going to be copying this formula down, we want to say, well, just look to the left of me and use that as the criteria. Okay, so I'm going to say make that E2 bearings, and notice it says I'm looking in that column there and I'm seeing 324 cells that look like that. Okay, and I think that's what we want. Now, if I say OK, now I might want to put, because I might be copying this formula over to the right, I might want to make this always stay in column E, because that's going to be part of my criterion. So I'm going to hit my F4 key 3 times and say, I always want to stay in column E, but we might be changing the row. So that tells me 324 bearings. And now if I copy that down by double-clicking the fill box, it says here are the totals that match all that. Just for grins, notice I'm looking down in my status bar and it says there's a total of 991 right here that I've selected. And remember, this went down to row 992 and we've got headings, so it looks like it matches. Now in this column, we want the total dollar value of items shipped. Notice in our data, we've got the value of the item shipped in column B. We don't want to total all those things, but we want to pick out the numbers that match bearings on the left. So we want to use the SUMIF function. And we'll look that up in our insert function. Notice there are 2 things. One is SUMIF, and it says adds the cells specified by a given condition, by a given condition. SUMIFs is plural, by a given set of conditions. So if you wanted more than one condition, you could use the SUMIFs, but we're just going to use the SUMIF because we only have one condition. So let's use that, and it says, here are the 2 things we saw before, the range and the criteria for that range, but you can also pick a different sum range. In other words, column A is the range for the criteria, but column B is the range that you want to sum. You can't sum up these texts. So the range that we're going to evaluate is our A2 to A992 absolute again. The criteria is going to be our E2 again, so I'll click in that and hit the F4 3 times. It says bearings, and notice it says right now your sum is 0 because there's nothing in that column that can be added. It's all text. But I can say, these are the actual cells to sum, and that would be this column, B2 to B992 absolute. And it says there's your total of all those values in that column that say bearings to the left of them. So I'm going to click OK, and now I'm going to double click the fill box, and that should fill that formula down. Notice what is my total? 43,361.09. I can go to the bottom of column B, do an auto sum, and that should be that same total, 43,361.10. The third thing they want us to do is to find the average number of days that the bearings were held in inventory, the timing belts, the air filters, etc. And this is the same idea, except instead of counting how many or adding together their total, we're going to average their number of days if it matches this thing on the left. So here's the number of days. We want to pick the ones that say bearings and average them. So there's a function called average if. And we're going to use our insert function again. Average if. And notice there's an average ifs as well if you had multiple criteria. But we only have one. We just want to know if it says bearings or fan belts or whatever. So we'll do that. This is exactly like sum if. It's exactly like it, except it's not going to sum those numbers. It's going to average those numbers. So, oh my gosh, we could copy that sucker over and just change the name of the function. Ooh, let's do that. I'm going to select these sum if functions. Notice I've got it all set so that I can fill it to the right and it'll still go to the same things. So I copied those functions to the right, and now if I select these 5 cells, I'm going to say find SUM in those 5 cells only and replace it with AVERAGE. So now all the sum ifs will become average ifs. So I'm going to replace all, and it should say you've made 5 replacements. There we go. And there is our average days held in inventory if. That seems a little high. Oh, it's not column B that we want. It's column C to average. Never mind. So everywhere I see a $B, I want a $C. I should have just done it by hand once. I'll do that in a moment. If you had 1,000,000 of these, this would be a lot easier way to do it than typing them all by hand. So I'm going to say every time you see a $B, put a $C, and that should be 10 replacements because there's 2 of them in each cell. Ah, that's more like it. Now let's start over and do it the way most of us would have done it if we hadn't thought we were going to save ourselves a bunch of time. We're going to say, give me average if. The range that I want evaluated is this thing that gives the description. That's the thing we've done all along. The criteria that I want to match it against is this description right here, bearings. And the range I want to average is column C. And now it tells me that's this. And then I copy it down, and I would get exactly the same thing. Number 11 basically says, here's 5 days worth of bearings orders that actually happened over the last 5 days, 324. in our simulation, we said, let's take the mean, add 3 standard deviations to it, and then multiply that by 5. So we said 490, that's how many we would recommend it to have there for 5 days, and that was plenty to cover the 324. So I'll just say our simulation recommended 490 bearings to cover a 5-day demand. I don't want it to wrap the text, so I'm going to hit left justified and let it spill into the next cells. This was plenty of inventory to fulfill our actual 5-day orders of this number right here, which is 324. And do the same thing to that. And number 12 simply says double check everything, make sure you made it look pretty and all that. Thus endeth the lesson on page 153.